semester. So, second. So for those who don't know me, my name is Bruna Alvarez. I am a PhD candidate in the School of Natural Resources and Environment. So I'll be co-organizing the Tropilunch. So this is the first one that I'm co-organizing. So as a second speaker of the semester, I am pleased to introduce Dr. Emilio Bruna.
But slowly, because he's still trying to find his talk because he doesn't work with PCs.
So Dr. Bruna is a distinguished teacher, scholar, and professor at the University of Florida, where he holds a joint appointment in the Department of Wildlife Ecology and Conservation and the Center for Latin American Studies. He earned his bachelor's and master's degree from the University of California, San Diego, and his PhD in population biology from the University of California, Berkeley. Following an NSF minority postdoctoral fellowship at Brazil's Instituto Nacional de Pesquisas da Amazônia, he joined the University of Florida faculty in 2002. His research explores plant demography, plant-animal interactions in tropical ecosystems, as well as the structure of scientific institutions and collaborative networks. Dr. Bruna has also provided leadership in the field through his service as editor-in-chief of the Biotropica, as past president of the Association for Tropical Biology and Conservation, and secretary of the Ecological Society of America. In recognition of his outstanding contribution, he was elected as fellow of the American Association for the Advancement of Science in 2022. So with that, I will hand the stage to Emilio, and please join me welcoming Roberto.
Hey everybody. So I was asked by someone I know in the TCD program to help bail them out of a jam because there was no speaker as of Friday, and I was delighted to have a talk that I could give ready to go. I tried to do a little updating. You'll notice, well, I'll give an explanation in a bit, but what I will tell you is that, first of all, if you can't hear me, or for some reason out in Zoom land, people can't hear me, just say something instead of waving into the camera. If I have my back to the screen, so I may not be able to hear, okay? And the other thing is that there's a section here that has a lot of data that are available. Not only the presentation, the paper that came out of it, but all the data are available on my GitHub repository. And there was a slew of literature that goes all the way back to the early 1900s that went into working and thinking about this talk. That's all available as a Zotero reading list. If anybody would like it, they have access to it as well. If you can't track it down, just let me know. Yeah. See where we go. Okay, so this talk was originally given at the Cartagena meeting of the Association for Tropical Biology and Conservation. So a lot of it is focused on that particular audience, but there's a lot of overlap between that audience and this audience. So although a lot of it will be ATBC kind of focused, I hope you'll be able to translate from that context into this one. And yeah, okay, there we go. The first thing I want to say before I even tell you what I'm going to say or say it is that this is not by any means a comprehensive historical review or overview of this subject. There are some really phenomenal books on tropical biology, tropical science from a variety of different perspectives. These are some of the ones that I think are really great. There's a list of some others here. The Picturing Tropical Nature book is really fascinating. It's about the depiction of tropical ecosystems in art. The question of whether there is such a thing as tropical biology, what is tropical biology, what's the future of tropical biology, that's also something people have been wrestling with for a long time. In 1986, Dan Jansen wrote a great annual review of this subject in true Dan Jansen form. It's supposed to be the annual review of ecology and systematics. You consolidate all the literature. There is no literature cited in Dan Jansen's annual review. It's a really phenomenal paper. There's also Michael Robinson, whose paper actually, the title of his paper inspired this one, obviously, which is this Tropical Biology Real, which was written in the journal Tropical Ecology. I should also add that the previous version of the talk, the slides and everything are available as a PowerPoint on that same GitHub repository. But if you'd like an updated copy of them, I'll be sure to post it on my website as well. So this is not a comprehensive overview. There's been a lot of that, and I want to make sure I acknowledge that literature. So I'll start in kind of perhaps an unusual way, which is by answering this question. And I'll tell you that there are really three answers to this question. So is there really such a thing as tropical biology? The answers are no, maybe, and yes, which sounds maybe like I'm equivocating a bit. But I'd like to walk you through. I think like a lot of questions, it really is context dependent, and it really depends on exactly both the framework in which you approach the question and the information with which you attempt to answer it. So I'm going to try to walk you through a little bit of that logic, and we'll go step by step. So let's start with the first one. Is there really such a thing as tropical biology? And the answer is unequivocally no. Okay. And for me, this actually started a long time ago, or at least thinking about this particular subject and how we approach it. Back in grad school, and I think like a lot of people have probably gotten some version of this decision letter from an editor when it came to submission of a journal article. This is verbatim from one of mine, which is the scope of your paper makes it more appropriate for a specialized journal focusing on tropical systems. I should emphasize that the reviews were largely positive. Like all reviews, there's a couple things to work on, mostly pretty small, but the feeling is this is specialized, this is narrow, this is focused on tropical ecosystems. And it was from a pretty high profile journal I was really excited to submit to, and which is emphasizing the breadth and importance and how the work that they're trying to publish is really something that people can use broadly in the field. And if you think very carefully about that language, which I noticed Betty nodding, Betty, who gets very few papers rejected, has gotten that rejection maybe. I don't know if Stephen, Karen, anybody else has gotten that. But if you actually go and dissect the language, what that's telling you is that you've got biology. This is what, when we talk about specialization and what a kind of a subdiscipline is, what it's telling you is that you have, kind of biology, the discipline in the esoteric broad sense. And specializations are work on unique, and no one's saying unimportant, but subsets of that broader discipline that inform our broader understanding, right? That's what a specialization is. If you're a cardiologist, you're working on a subset of the human body. You're specialized in the heart and the circulatory system, and that's what you're doing. You're contributing to kind of the breadth of our understanding of human health by working on that specialized, one could say, fine-tuning our understanding of this foundational discipline, which is the biological sciences. So that's kind of what's not even implicit in the decision letter that I got. It's actually explicit, right? You need to submit this to somewhere that's more specialized, a journal that's more specialized, because that's what you're doing. You're doing specialized subdisciplinary work relative to the entire field. And so that really got me thinking a lot about how we might actually think about that and why that is. I've been a member of the Association for Tropical Biology and Conservation since I was in graduate school. It's a great organization. I never particularly given a lot of thought to the use of the adjective there, tropical, to describe the kind of biology that goes into what we do, right? That particular adjective and its weight. This is the implication. This is what our specialization is. It's not the Association for Biology and Conservation. It's the Association for Tropical Biology and Conservation in much the same way as we might have, a program like this, right? We have the Tropical Conservation and Development Program. It's not the Program in Conservation and Development. And so this, we've joined this organization. We're participants in programs like this, in which this adjective really comes to define us. But these are also really good ways to think about the ways in which scholars conceptualize their disciplines, right? There are a couple of different ways that people who are kind of taking a more macro approach to understanding and mapping knowledge do it. you can look at the kinds of subjects that people study. And you can think about the way that scholars self-associate into intellectual communities. That's a really good reflection of how people see the disciplines falling out. And there's lots of overlap in there. Sometimes people are members of multiple intellectual communities, and those intellectual communities could be things like, say, journals. Journals happen when someone, a group of people will get together and say, we have this thing in common. We'd like to read other things in the same area. These academic and scholarly communities are ways that people self-associate because they have something in common intellectually. And so I actually, was thinking about this and the different kinds of scholarly communities that are out there, and they kind of tend to be formed around 3 different domains. So the first is kind of I can't move too much because of the camera, but the first is kind of a conceptual domain. And so you see a lot of scholarly societies around a conceptual domain. It's something that, transcends methodological approaches to interrogate that domain, as well as using different systems to investigate the kind of fundamental questions that underpin that domain. So we've got the Colombian Association for Evolutionary Biology, right? Evolutionary biology being this kind of unifying principle and conceptual domain. People use lots of different plants and animals to study evolutionary biology. They use lots of different techniques to study it. The Society of Systematic Biologists, again, the conceptual domain here being systematic biology and using a systematic approach to using systematics to understand a little about the organization of biological systems. There's the Ecological Society of America, so kind of ecology is our unifying conceptual approach, and then finally the Society for Conservation Biology, which is kind of an offshoot of multiple disciplines, but which itself is thought to have its own conceptual space, body of theory that guides it and underpins it. So, tropical biology, the assumption would be if you're going to, you have conservation biology or evolutionary biology, is tropical biology a conceptual domain? Well, probably not, because people, there are people study kind of the ecology of tropical systems. They study the evolution of tropical systems. They study their systematics. It kind of doesn't fit in really well with this. Now, the other thing you might have is, why am I going backwards? Use the keyboard instead. So another common way in which people self-organize is around systemic domains, right? So here, these are a particular system that people are interested in studying, and they do this using a variety of conceptual approaches: the evolution of insects, the ecology of insects, the management of insects, and a lot of methodologies. You might use molecular biology or use population ecology, but you see communities of scholars organized around systemic domains: the Royal Entomological Society, the Brazilian Society for Mastozoology, the American Ornithological Society. There are a few of these which maybe you might get close to what we're doing here. The Society for Island Biology. You do have the occasional Society for Wetland Science. You have these kind of more clear, geographically bounded domains. So people study islands. They think islands are interesting. They are interesting, and they can study islands anywhere in the world. But, tropical biology, again, kind of fails in this test as well. Anybody know what, technically speaking, the definition of something being tropical is? We've got the lines there, north and south. So anybody know why exactly the tropics of Cancer and Capricorn are 23 degrees, 22 minutes and 20 seconds north and south of the equator? Does anybody remember that, just out of curiosity? People may not be aware of the specific reason. Go, Stephen.
The sun in the sky goes above and below during the course.
You would have gotten a C on the quiz question in my class, but you're in the right area, right? Which is actually that exact latitude, north and south, 23, 22, 20, is the last point on the surface of the Earth that has one complete day of direct overhead sunlight per year, at least. If you're just north or south of that line, you do not get direct overhead sunlight any time of the year. It gets close, but it's not directly overhead. That's the distinction of what's between those two tropics, north and south. And So that's the geographical bounding of what the tropics is, in the way that islands, right, would be bodies of land that are emergent from water. But it doesn't really fit in well with the biology of the systems that we study. You know, depending on where you live, you might consider this a perfectly tropical species, right? So Naswa and coatis, but you could see them in southern Arizona if you're lucky, right? Jaguars are, well, it's gotten a little more difficult with the wall, but you can find jaguars in southern Texas now, and that is, of course, their historical distribution as well. You know, we've got a lot of birds that are neotropical migrants, so you see it as a tropical bird. If you happen to be seeing it when it's in its breeding range, you might see it as a temperate species. When it, you know, if you happen to be in Baltimore and looking at an oriole or something, that's when you think of it. So the biology of what we consider tropical species is often not very tropical, and it certainly transcends this geographical bounding. In fact, Ken Feely and James Stroud have a really great review paper in which they went and looked at all the different ways that people publishing research on tropical systems define the tropics. We can't even decide amongst ourselves as tropical biologists what it means to be a tropical system. Direct overhead solar radiation, net positive energy balance, annual temperatures don't vary with latitude. I mean, area where the mean annual biotemperature is greater than or equal to 24 degrees Celsius, areas where seasonality of precipitation exceeds the seasonality of temperature, which is, you know, you can technically calculate it, but it's pretty loose. So tropical biologists can't even decide amongst themselves what it means for something to be tropical. It's pretty clear that this isn't exactly a conceptual domain that we overlap well with. And then finally, you've got methodological domains which transcend the other two. So the Society for Mathematical Biology is used to address lots of really interesting questions in ecology, evolution, conservation, experimental biology, molecular biology and evolution, the African Society for Bioinformatics and Computational Biology. So you've got these three major ways in which scholarly communities, the scholars kind of self-associate into intellectual communities, and tropical biology just does not fit neatly into any of them. In some ways, it transcends all of them. You've got people studying all kinds of systems in the tropics using lots of different methods, and from the perspective of lots of different conceptual domains in just an organization like this, or in a room of people like we have like this. So it's really challenging to think that it's a discipline, at least in the way in which scholars, without overthinking it, kind of self-associate into clean disciplines. And more to the point, it really depends on where you are. I mean, we call it tropical biology, but if you're a graduate of Rosario, which was our host for the ATBC meeting, or the University of Sao Paulo, or the University of Kuala Lumpur, your degree is in biology. Your degree is not in tropical biology when you graduate, right? They don't use geographic modifiers on the names of degrees or the topics of courses when you're in the tropics themselves. They don't call it tropical biology, they just call it biology. I've got biology class. So it's not something that in any way seems to be kind of intellectually aligned with being a different discipline. So the question then is, how is it we came to think about it that way? How is it that that adjective came to be here? And it's really that the tropics, kind of broadly defined as this distinct and unique entity apart, you know, with that adjective, is really it's a historical artifact. It's kind of been ingrained in us culturally, rather than, at least thinking about it this way, having anything to do with kind of boundaries in terms of intellectual thought. It really comes down, and its origins of this idea is the tropics being distinct and apart, to Marco Polo, who was not the first European to make their way over to tropical Asia, but was the first one to popularize it. People don't know it's Marco Polo. You might be able to tell from context clues. He's holding a book called In Milioni, which was his nickname. So he had a totally cool hipster, you know, influencer nickname. His name was Marco Millions, was what he was known as, because all his writing was about the tropical Asia. It was all about the superlatives. He was the first person who came back. He didn't actually write the book. He told stories to someone who then wrote them down, and he made a fortune telling, his stories about his first adventures, which were a search for basically 4 plants. These are I tell my students, there are 4 plant species that kind of set in motion contemporary global history, and why it is that the Spaniards are here, ended up here in Florida, and we, speaking Spanish instead of other languages, and that's the search for ginger, pepper, nutmeg, and cinnamon. That's what Marco Polo was going for, those 4 primary commodities at the time. There were others, silk and stuff like that, but really those were the 4 commodities that most people were going to Asia looking for. And then, the Pope got involved, and after the Ottoman Turks sacked Constantinople, the Pope said, okay, we can't go overland anymore. So everybody from this point in Africa everything over there is now Portuguese. So the Portuguese worked their way down around the coast, and Spain got the other stuff. They had to negotiate that again to make sure that the Portuguese got a little chunk of Brazil. I mean, all of that was because we wanted this stuff, but Constantinople over there underneath the UR screen sharing was cut off. And because it was cut off in the overland route went that direction, they speak Portuguese in Angola and Spanish in America, right? But it was this writing about the tropics and that of future Europeans traveling around the world that kind of really set in play some of this notion that we have about the tropics being this really distinct and in many ways very special ecosystem. Walter Raleigh, in his History of the World, spent a lot of time in Guyana, is writing about Guyana is really beautiful. He says, if there be any place on earth of the nature, beauty, and delight that paradise had, it must be found within the tropics. And this isn't just like being flowery. This was actually a major intellectual question at the time among kind of religious thinkers, which is where on earth is the location of the Garden of Eden? And a major argument was whether it was right on the equinoctial line, the equator, or if that was too hot and it had to be just below. And Sir Walter Raleigh, after traveling around, decided that no, he thought Eden, like the Garden of Eden, had to be just below the equator, probably in the Americas. And he placed it just south and east of Guyana. So this was a major thing. You have this search. This is a Coutts imagery about, he painted this in northeastern Brazil, usually painting people, kind of with this Greco-Roman influence. You have a series of writers or artists, as in the case of Ekut, who pitched it a completely different way. Marco Polo wrote, I assure you that all the men of this island have heads like dogs, teeth and eyes likewise, and they eat everybody that they can catch, which is what Theodore de Bry illustrated in his illustrations from the Americas. This is a remarkable book. De Bry never actually went to the Americas. It was all depictions of Indians all the way from Virginia in today's United States, all the way down to South America and what they look like. It's a remarkable volume. I actually got to hold it and take pictures of it on my sabbatical. It was really wonderful. And I should point out that this is the story that most Europeans had at the time. This was word of mouth. This was, Twitter at the time. And so this is the image that people had. Some people read Walter Raleigh. Some people read Marco Polo and de Bry. I should emphasize that if you really want to, we can get into it afterwards. But Europeans at the time were per capita consuming far more human remains than in anybody in any other part of the world. There was actual consumption of human body parts, probably ritualistically in at least some places, but in Europe all the way through the Victorian era, people ate humans all the time. They just didn't think of it as cannibalism. They thought of it as medicine because they would grind up mummies and drink them in tea for their health benefits. So, but this is what typically happens. You have you have the tropics, what they were, narratives about them spread like wildfire. The public consume them and then transform them. And it's really important to remember that people who then went to the tropics afterwards, Walter Raleigh or Marco Polo's writing or de Bry's images were kind of where they went to go do their homework about what they were going to see when they arrived in these faraway lands. And so they went with their own expectations. And what you end up seeing over this cycle of consumption of narratives and their transformation is that you arrive at a series of tropes about tropical ecosystems that people generally kind of, they call them maybe different things, but it's the idea of the tropics as paradise, a green hell. They're mystical environments. They're places that are exploitable for their incredible natural resources, gold, timber, spices, you name it, El Dorado. They're a place for self-discovery. You can go to the tropics, and if you're able to survive, you're going to come out a better person for it. And so you see this kind of through the historical narratives, and we see it repeated, of course, culturally as well. Both kind of, let's draw the distinction between, say, high culture, arts, literature, music, and more popular culture, which is perhaps more important in terms of the reach it has. So it could be the paintings of Gauguin as, Paradise, or you could have Love Island, if you watch Love Island on Peacock. Encanto and 100 Years of Solitude are the high-end, popular culture of the mystical tropics. The Heart of Darkness versus Naked and Afraid. Eat, Pray, Love is the example of overcoming. There's a chapter in there which we read with my undergrads. It's just wild. And my personal favorite is also the way in which transmit so many of these tropes in new and different ways through music and fashion. This is Dolce & Gabbana's Spring 2020 collection, in which they envision women wild in the jungle like nymphs. There's a lot mixed up in there, including Greek mythology, Roman mythology, and going through the jungle. And you're obviously a tropical nymph if you're wearing your British Army khakis as you're going through the jungle with your, kind of mishmash tropical pineapple stuff. So we see this kind of idea. This is really where it comes from. And the historian David Arnold, I think, put it really well in a really interesting book, which is that calling parts of the globe the tropics became this way of defining something as environmentally and culturally distinct. We're able to both to set it apart from us, right? It's different, it's unique, but also it's a way of smoothing over all the differences that you see within the tropics. So to refer to something as the tropics is both to set it apart from where you are, but it's also to make it completely generic because it ignores the differences you've got linguistically and culturally and geographically, and my interest, kind of biologically, between these different constituent regions of the tropical world. Right? It's a really great distillation of some of these ideas. But what you ultimately get is that this is kind of, you have this Platonic ideal in our minds because of all this acculturation of what a really phenomenal, exotic, tropical field site looks like, right? It looks like something like this, which people stare at, and I've seen at least 2 or 3 people nodding until I tell you that this is not an exotic tropical field site. This is Pandora at Disney's World of Avatar at Disney World. But there's a reason that everybody's like, oh yeah, it looks great. I'm trying to figure out what these aloes are. Because, when they were, Pandora is jungles in space. And if you've actually seen the movie Fern Gully, The Last Rainforest, there's a generation that's shaped by that movie. Pandora and that movie are the exact same movie, right? And because that's why Pandora looks the way it does, it looks like what we all know that tropical jungles look like. They don't really exist. There is no such thing as tropical biology. That's where this idea came from. The first people who went there to study the biology, that's what they had been reading, that's what they had been hearing. So they went there kind of with this idea in mind that the tropical zone and the temperate zone are really distinct and unique places. They went, like von Humboldt, to study the biology. And that led to this kind of distinction that the tropics are different from the temperate zone, but that means that the biology in the tropics is different from that biology that meaning that had been established throughout Europe, which is kind of where the science of biology and then ecology and evolutionary biology really got their start, kind of set it apart. And I'll just allude to it here. Megan Rabbit came to give a talk here many, many years ago. This is a spectacular book, or she won a bunch of awards for it. It's called The American Tropics, The Caribbean Roots of Biodiversity Science. And it's about the establishment of field stations in the tropics by the scientists from, say, the University of Chicago or Harvard, and how that really shaped the development of biological thinking, and the flip side, kind of what effect that had on the local communities where these field stations were set up, which were often, the impacts were very different depending on who set it up and what institution they were from. Really phenomenal book, worth reading. So again, getting us back to this idea, we've got the biology of the tropics is unique. It's about fine-tuning this foundation, but a lot of it has to do with this acculturation. Biology began here as a formal discipline and focused, on then going to the tropics somewhere far away, and it's mixed up with all the kind of cultural context, including kind of the geographic imagery we have shaped by the Mercator projections, which tends to distort kind of the geographic actual area of different countries in the world relative to their actual area, which is the dark blue. But if you think about it, there's this idea that the tropics are a part, kind of as a biological, we've got biology, and then we've got the tropics as this, what we use to fine tune and specialize our biological thinking, just kind of flies in the face of actually how the world's ecosystems are spread around the world and organized. biodiversity of the world is almost primarily concentrated in the tropics, slightly broadly defined beyond those parallels, but that's where most of the world's species are. They're in the tropics. It's where about 40% of the terrestrial surface area of the Earth is. It's in the tropics. About 43% of the human population by latitude is within the tropics. It's going to be 50% by 2025. And in terms of how those people are concentrated, the emerging global megacities through 2100 are almost entirely in the tropics as well. Megacities like, say, Kinshasa or something like that, Nairobi, they are in other parts of the world now, but they're almost entirely concentrated here. So I would argue that, in fact, we're thinking about this as the tropics are a part and different and used for fine tuning, but it's pretty clear that that's actually where biologically most of our baseline actually is, and where increasingly human impacts on that biology are going to be as well. But it's still a difficult habit to break. And so if you go through the literature, it's remarkable. You'll actually go through the literature and you can't unsee those kinds of artificial distinctions once you start looking for them. So these are a couple of really important papers that have come out relatively recently, one by a colleague of Wojtek Nowotny and colleagues. Insects, this is another one here by Evan Seaman and David Tillman as well. This was in Nature, Insect Species Diversity, Abundance, and Body Size Relationships. And this is why there's so many species of herbivorous insects in tropical rainforest. Now, that was done in old regenerating fields in Minnesota, and this was done in Papua New Guinea in primary rainforest. If the situation were reversed, right, and we actually, the place where most of the biology actually was considered the baseline, that would be the title of Wojtek's paper, and that might be the title of the Seaman et al. Paper. Two other fundamentally important papers in my field, the latitudinal gradient and geographical range, George Stevens, how so many species coexist in the tropics. You've got Bob Payne's fundamental paper on Paysaster, food web complexity and species diversity, right? The idea of keystone species is this paper in the American Naturalist. And again, you see it, there's a geographic marker here, but not here. This paper, if the situation were reversed, might be the latitudinal gradient and geographic range, why are there so few species in the temperate zone? Surprisingly strong effects of predatory starfish on a moderate diversity food web of a North American tide pool. The diversity of these food webs is actually remarkably low. It's a phenomenal experiment, don't get me wrong. But we don't question the idea that we put geographical markers on one side or not the other. This is not new. In an address given to the Panama Conference on Tropical Biology in 1966 by Dylan Ripley, wrote, here in the United States, as inevitably a temperate zone-oriented people, we've always lived here, culture in temperate regions, this involves our science as well. It's not surprising that a disproportionate amount of the scientific information we have gathered concerns a phenomena immediately about us in cooler, strongly seasonal climates. As a result, in the case of biology, a major part of this accumulated biological knowledge is concerned with a rather minor part of the world's fauna and flora because of the chance development of biology in the temperate zone. Because the field developed in Europe and North America, that's what we kind of consider our theoretical baseline. Those are the systems that people worked on to develop the underpinnings of our field. And then they would go off to the tropics, be blown away and say, things don't work. They don't match our theory and our expectations. These are unusual cases to be studied because they're unusual, so that we can maybe fine tune the theory, as opposed to thinking like, wow, maybe I'm just working in a corner of this biodiversity. And in fact, it's the theory that's wrong, not that the systems don't fit the theory. But it's not a new issue. This, people have been saying this for a really long time. And so maybe instead what we should be thinking about is, given that there's clearly no such thing as tropical biology, at least in the biological standpoint, it's this kind of artificial construct. It did make me wonder if instead of having the Association for Tropical Biology or the Tropical Conservation Development Program, we should maybe instead encourage our colleagues to set up their own niche societies and training programs for their highly specialized systems that they focus on, here in temperate ecosystems. I really like the TCD one. What?
Cold is instead of temperate.
Yeah, okay, sure. Yeah, well, yeah, we have cold in the tropics too, though, right? We have tropical mountains and tropical glaciers. Is there really such a thing as tropical biology? No. That said, it is entirely possible that despite those differences, that there are different biological rules that are relevant and important in these different places. And so it could be that while the biology may be concentrated primarily in the tropics, the relevant theoretical issues or most important questions could be different in those two kind of broad geographical regions. And so it could be that while there is no such thing really is that distinction may be artificial, people are studying different things because there are different things that are important depending on where you are, right? So could be that that's where the distinction is in tropical biology, not so much as is there the tropics, but are different ecological theories and questions relevant with as a function of geography. So to look at that, I actually decided to look at what was being studied. And so I pulled all the articles in the four kind of leading tropical journals, Revista de Biología Tropical, Tropical Conservation Science, Biotropica, and the Journal of Tropical Ecology from 2022. I also did 5 kind of global broad ecology journals, so journals that are kind of independent of geography. They're leading ones in the field: Journal of Animal Ecology, the Journal of Ecology, Evolution, and the American Naturalist. And then taking advantage of some of the things that you can do with the records for these in Web of Science and Scopus, I looked at all the articles from 1990 to 2022, and I broke apart all their titles and keywords to see if I could actually see if those titles and keywords from tropical journals and then global journals fell apart in different ways. Of course, it's important to remember there is work about tropical ecosystems published in these journals as well. So I had to find the tropical literature in these journals, pull it out, and put it over here as well. So there is tropical literature here, plus this tropical literature, and then the non-tropical literature that is here as well. It worked out to be about 141,000 or so key and title words after you do all the what's called stemming and lemmatizing and everything. So rainforests, all those get pulled together, that kind of thing. And so I'm going to put some of the results up here, see if you can kind of see patterns, and then let's see if they actually match. So this is what you these are the top, I can't remember, I think 20 or something keywords out of the combinations in the kind of global journals without the non-tropical articles in the global journals, right? So these are the top keywords and title words. So it includes both what they call dyads, so 2-word combinations that were topped. So like natural selection, you can analyze them at the individual word, natural and selection, or some words go together, and then keywords as well. So sexual selection, that kind of thing. And so these are the ones from tropical journals. And see if anything stands out. I know, in the interest of time, because I do have to keep going, I think. Anything pop out to anybody?
Nice.
Yeah. So in the tropical ones, there's lots of top words that are descriptors of and I'm going to save you the trouble of taking that picture because it's actually, there are 2 tables of this in the paper that came out. So it's actually the paper in Biotropica has the full tables as well. So you'll see it in a sec. But yeah, these are the top words. There's a lot of geographic denominators: Brazil, Panama, Mexico, Puerto Rico. Costa Rica is up at the top, as well as those terms like tropical forest or tropical tree. Those kinds of things are the top words. Yeah. And in fact, it's almost certain that lots of people in these global journals were studying coevolution in food webs in Costa Rica or Panama, but those aren't the keywords or title words that are used in those articles. And in fact, if you remove those geographic descriptors and you reanalyze the data set, what you find is that there's actually a lot of conceptual overlap. This is from the paper. I didn't want to put it up. I don't want to belabor it, but you have a lot of conceptual overlap. There's still lots of things that are kind of unique to different ones. So there are things that people working in the tropics are studying based on keywords that people in the temperate zone are kind of prioritizing other things. But there's also a lot that they have in common, which is maybe not entirely surprising. So the whole data set of the 140,000 words, all the articles, the keywords, the dyads, the triads, the whole thing, if people want to do something with it, it's available. It goes further back than the whatever it is that I used 1990 going forward. So people are welcome to take advantage of it. It's all been included.
What is trust?
Oh, sorry. So Drosophila melanogaster is the one. There are 2. So that's fruit flies. So that's all the evolution studies. on Drosophila melanogaster, sorry, I meant to mention, that's the one biological term. There's also, if you go back and look at another list, there is USA, does appear in the global journals once, but that's because the Ecological Society of America required that if you were working in the United States for your field work, the keywords had to include, like Ordway Swisher Biological Station USA. They didn't require it for any other anybody working in a field station anywhere outside of the United States, only in the USA. So USA popped up, to the top of those as well. This is something I should point out that Anderson and where is it? Castro Torres and Alvarez Gutierrez pointed out in 2022. They did a huge review of social science literature as well, and they tend to find that authors from or working in the global south have a much higher frequency of geographic indicators in their article titles as well. It's the same pattern that we see here in biology. The question, of course, is this kind of toucan or an egg problem, because you've got the problem of it's unclear whether scientists have kind of naturally gravitated toward these things, or if the editor who was giving me my feedback has been giving that feedback for 60 years. And so you have these kinds of certain topics end up getting relegated to the tropics over the course of kind of our scientific progress. Or if it's just that people naturally gravitated that direction. That's not something you can quite address with data sets like this. So that's why I left this as a maybe section. It's unclear. There is some evidence that people think that there are some really different topics, and they certainly are some different ones, but whether those lines are hard and fast or not is unclear. And so the final question is then, why did I answer yes to the question kind of in the final part here? And that is that I really think that what makes tropical biology distinct as a discipline isn't actually the biology. Right? It's not the theory that people are using to address their questions. It's not the experimental designs. That's not to say there aren't differences, but those aren't as big differences as we imagine. What makes tropical biology different is really the context in which this work is done, right? So this looks like this absolutely spectacular primary tropical forest until you zoom out a little bit and you realize that it is one of the largest national parks in the world. It just also happens to be surrounded by one of the highest population densities in the world as well. And that context is really unique because while we have large natural areas, obviously in the United States and Europe, they're not necessarily within this kind of cultural context as well. And of course, there's the other kind of context that goes with working in tropical countries as well. You have extremes in income inequality that are often unmatched with what people studying, ecosystems in the temperate zone might come across. When I first, the week after I was giving this talk, a bunch of our colleagues at the ATBC meeting couldn't make it because Sri Lanka was in the middle of political upheaval. So you've got graduate students who are trying to do their field work, and they're dealing with things like, should we go into the presidential palace to get rid of, our speaker in parliament? And those are things that, well, I don't know, when I gave the talk in Colombia, I was like, we don't have to deal with this stuff. But, there are political contexts in which a lot of our colleagues work, which are really, really different from the context in which we work. We still have our political complications, but as yet, I don't have to make the decision about whether my students should go do field work at the Ordway or whether they should go storm, they should go storm the Capitol. Realized that was interesting. Okay. The tropics are also incredibly dangerous places to work, not just for the physical danger that tropical biologists face. You're far away. I mean, you get bitten by a snake, here or there, but it may be harder to get care or those kinds of things depending on where you are. But it's also incredibly dangerous to be an environmental journalist, an environmental activist. Other than working in certain parts of the Middle East, environmental journalism is the most dangerous field in journalism. Right? And so the people who work in the tropics on environmental issues face dangers that people don't face anywhere else, all in the context of declining science funding. Again, not something I anticipated a couple of years ago in giving this talk that we might be dealing with, but this was the decline that colleagues in Brazil were facing in terms of their national science funding budget from 2019 to 2021. And so trying to do science and scholarship in this context is very different. illegal logging mafias. It's a dangerous place to work as a biologist or someone who's working in those systems. I should emphasize that it's a little more complicated than we often recognize. We tend to polarize things into good for the environment in terms of presidential, say, leadership, or bad for the environment. But let's not forget that, and Enrico Bernard is the one who did this study, and I asked him if he had an update, and he said it was too depressing. The largest increase in degazetting of protected areas in Brazil was not during the government you might have thought it is. It was actually during Lula's government, right? So things are complicated. It's not always as clear cut as we might think it is. There's, of course, working in the tropics, my colleagues working in tropical systems, there's language barriers, there's citation biases based on what address is on your article, open access articles, which are increasingly the way a lot of journals are running. To publish an article on the average price of an open access article is $900 across all open access journals. It obviously goes way higher, and it far exceeds what a PhD student in lots of tropical countries make in a month in terms of their scholarship. And all within dealing with this kind of complicated context as a scientist. I mean, honestly, it sounds like an absolutely awful job. I'm wrapping it up here. And so kind of what does the future hold? And I'm reminded again of another fantastic quote of Dan Jansen's, which is that there are very few more presumptuous things than a US scientist holding forth on the future of tropical ecology. I like to think what the world might have been if anybody ever heard of the Hylian Institute? In 1948, eight UNESCO countries, including Italy, Peru, Venezuela, the Netherlands, France, Ecuador, they got together and decided to found a research institute network in the tropics called the Hylian Institute. The base was going to be in Manaus, but they were going to have research institutes in Ecuador, also in Belém, Iquitos, Gibraltar, San Fernando de Atabapo, and Sinaloa in Colombia, and they had $300,000 to jumpstart it, and they were getting ready to go. And then in typical bureaucratic issues, it all fell apart. Indirectly, this has actually led to the formation of INPA in Manaus. But there was a time when the leading way to study tropical ecosystems was going to be a network led by a Brazilian physicist who worked for UNESCO. He was going to be the head of the system, and this was back in 1948, and it fell apart. So this was one alternative reality. We ended up going another one. So I think the future holds is that instead of disassociating ourselves from that adjective, we should really embrace it and embrace it for what it is. So we should kind of take back this idea of the tropics as being this baseline. They're not fine-tuning, they're actually foundation. It's where all the action is, it's where all the biology is. We should take pride in that. We should emphasize that. We should call it out when people, do things like send letters to the editor and say, yeah, you should really do this more specialized. You should be like, I'm sorry, I don't work on maple trees. I work in the tropics, but also recognize it and embrace it and kind of value it. There's no reason that we put the map of the world the way we normally see it. The Earth spins around in space. There is no such thing as upside down. People see this map and they freak out. It's from a great paper in Nature, but in fact, there's no reason why we couldn't put all the maps in the world out there this way. Because if we want the world to look this way, this is how it should. We should cite with purpose. Citation is a political act. Cite people that you like, cite people in the tropics, cite tropical work, because people are lazy. They cite the papers they see other people citing. So if you cite their work, people are going to cite it too. And that's going to spread the word about tropical systems. Teach with purpose, teach about people in the tropics. I will not tell you about Emily Snathledge other than to say that she was the first, she was the director of the Geldi Museum in Belém. She's a German zoologist. Once while doing field work, she cut her thumb. It started getting gangrenous. None of her materos would do it, so she cut off her thumb with a machete herself. Well, an amazing story, amazing ornithologist. We should be teaching with purpose, teaching about stuff like this, people like this. We should collaborate with purpose. When people see this figure, I ask them what they see. It's not actually a map. It's a drawing of georeference collaborations. And what you see is a lot of where the science is being done. We recognize those outlines. I ask them people the other thing they see a lot of connections, say, between Europe and what is clearly Sao Paulo and Rio and Minas, between Europe and the United States. There's some between, say, Europe, Japan, India. So they see that. Not a lot of north-south collaboration. We should emphasize that. But the other thing they see is I try to get them to tell me what they don't see here, which is there aren't a lot of lines going south to south. And so we should really be thinking about the way in which we collaborate and building up those collaboration networks across the global south. Find new ways to leverage public passion. I teach undergrads about the future of rainforests, and what really gets their attention is what's going to happen to chocolate and coffee over the course of the next 50 years to little bits of tropical rainforest that they carry around with them every single day. The number of teams of sports franchises in the United States that are named for tropical species, including the UC Irvine Fighting Anteaters, I kid you not. And so we should really be tapping into this at the corporate level. There are lots and lots of companies that are named for these, and so we need to figure out a way to leverage kind of these interests in tropical systems. I don't understand why we don't have every university that has a tiger or the gator or the anteater as its mascot doesn't have a conservation program for that species as part of its greenwashing. I'm happy to help them set it up for a very modest consulting fee. It's in the world of fashion. Balenciaga charged I can't remember, it's 3 or 7. I think is it 7,000 for this? Yeah, it's 7,000 for this top with their panther top and the skirt. I guarantee you they would not be charging 7,000. Squirrels are cool too, but this is not what people pay for. People pay for the Black Panther on their clothing. And finally, you got to get in the game. It's easy to complain, but it's harder to work. So I couldn't help but noticing that the other day the call for officers of the TCD student group went out. So this is your chance to actually do whatever you want. The great thing is we will give you money to go out and do stuff. It's unreal. You have an idea, you want a speaker to bring, you want to do an activity, you want to set up a hackathon, you want to set up a workshop, we don't care, we'll give you money. And of course, we do this with broader organizations. And finally, the last thing, what I'll end with is supporting and celebrating with one another. It takes a lot of hard work and resilience to do this, but it actually really matters. There's no more important thing to do this. And I love this quote from Kofi Annan, who has more science papers than most of us in the room, and that is that 95% of the new science in the world is created in countries comprising only 1/5 of the world's population, and much of that science in the realm of health, for example, you could go in the environment if you wanted to, neglects the problems that afflict most of the world. But there really is no better time to be a tropical biologist than to kind of embrace that call. And I ran over, sorry, but then again, I was filling in a gap, so and with that, I'm happy to take any last second questions. The paper's online. I'll put the slides up. Thanks a lot.